There's a photograph from March of 1966 sitting somewhere in a cardboard box or maybe a digital archive that almost nobody outside of drag racing has ever seen, and if you stumbled across it without knowing what you were looking at, you'd probably scroll right past it. 3 young guys in Pendleton shirts and a t-shirt, standing next to a bare aluminum dragster at a strip called Famoso Raceway just outside Bakersfield, California. They look like they wandered in from the beach. They look like they have absolutely no business being there. And they had just beaten the deepest top fuel field ever assembled in the history of American motorsport. Here's the thing, over 100 AA fuel dragsters showed up at that meet. The biggest names in drag racing were there. Don Garlits, Don Prudhomme, Connie Kalitta, James Warren and Roger Coburn, Roland Leong Hawaiian. And these 3 kids from Santa Monica with a homemade car built in a motel garage went through all of them. 8 months later, that car was for sale. Both their cars, actually, because by the end of 1966, these 3 guys had won pretty much everything they were ever going to win, and they quietly sold the equipment and walked away. They were in their mid-20s. They were at the absolute top of the sport. And they were done. This is legacy motoring. And I spend way too much time thinking about the history of motorsport and the untold stories of the people who shaped it. If you're someone who loves the forgotten corners of American racing history and the human decisions that defined an era, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. This is the story of how that happened, and it's the story of one of them who couldn't walk away, who refused to, and who paid for that decision 14 months after his partners closed the shop door behind them. So let me set the scene for you, because without understanding what top fuel drag racing was in the mid-1960s, none of what follows makes any sense at all. Top fuel drag racing in that era was the most dangerous thing you could do for money in American motorsport. Not marginally. Not by a small margin. By a wide, terrifying, and well-documented margin. The cars were slingshot dragsters, meaning the driver sat directly behind the rear axle with the engine in front of him and a bare aluminum scoop sticking up between his knees, feeding raw nitromethane into a supercharged Chrysler Hemi. Now, you might be thinking nitromethane is just a fancy kind of racing fuel. Here's what most people don't realize. Nitromethane is not gasoline. It is not even close to gasoline. It is a chemical compound that the federal government would later officially classify as more energetic per unit volume than TNT. After a railroad tanker of the stuff exploded near Niagara Falls in 1958, the industry put out white papers explaining exactly how dangerous it was. Most racers ignored those papers. They mixed it with alcohol or methanol. They ran it heavy or light depending on the weather. They hoped for the best. Drivers were getting killed at a steady rate. Clutch explosions cut chassis in half. Tires let go at over 200 miles an hour. The sport was professionalizing fast. Factory money was coming in. Sponsors were starting to dictate paint schemes. The owner-driver was on the way out. And if you wanted to win at the highest level in 1965 or 1966, you basically needed 3 things. You needed money. You needed a Keith Black motor or an Ed Pink motor. And you needed a driver who could hold the thing straight on a quarter-mile strip that offered essentially zero margin for error. Tom Jobe and Bob Skinner had none of those things. They were 2 kids from Santa Monica, California, who had known each other since high school. Jobe was born in 1940. Skinner in 1941. Jobe's older brother Al was a successful sportsman racer who had won H-Stock class at the 1961 NHRA Winter Nationals in a 57 Chevy, and Tom had grown up as Al's motorman, learning the feel of engines from the inside out before most kids his age had ever held a wrench. By the early 60s, Tom was enrolled at Santa Monica City College studying mechanical engineering. He was scientific. He was soft-spoken. Gary Matz, who would later be his boss at American Honda Racing, called him by far the smartest guy he had ever met in his entire life. Cole Cowan, the drag racing writer who interviewed Jobe more than anyone else, once called him drag racing's Feynman. If you know who Richard Feynman was, that is just about the highest compliment one human being can pay another. Bob Skinner was the wild card. He was a fiscal conservative dressed like a beatnik. He stood off at a distance and watched himself, as one friend put it. He kept a meticulous ledger. He worked at Carroll Shelby's shop in the mid-60s alongside a young guy named John Morton, who would later be known as Lotus John. And his mother owned and ran a place at 2711 Wilshire Boulevard in Santa Monica called the Red Apple Motel, which is going to matter in a minute. Now, you might be wondering why a team of California kids, who were eventually nicknamed the Surfers, had absolutely nothing to do with surfing. Because that is the truth. None of them actually rode waves. The persona was protective camouflage. They wore Pendleton shirts and deck shoes because that is what kids in Santa Monica wore. They rode skateboards through the pits at drag strips while their rivals thrashed on hot motors. Drag News started calling them the Surfers and the name stuck. Roland Leong, who raced against them, put it pretty plainly. They were the intellectual type, he said, as opposed to some greasy drag racers, which is what the rest of them were known for at the time. Jobe himself said they didn't know what to think of them. They were thought of as just some long-haired freaks from the beach. And this was before hippies were even really a thing. In 1958, the two of them attended their very first Bakersfield drag race together as teenage spectators. Same year as that nitromethane railroad explosion near Niagara Falls. And somewhere in there, Jobe got interested. Really interested. Not in the way most teenagers get interested in fast cars, where it's about the noise and the speed and the girls in the parking lot. Jobe got interested the way a physicist gets interested in a problem. He went to the Santa Monica Public Library, and he wrote letters to Commercial Solvents Corporation and to the federal government asking for the technical white papers on nitromethane. He got them. He read them. And he understood something that nobody else in drag racing seemed to understand, which is that nitromethane is not really a fuel in the conventional sense. It is a low explosive, and the trick is to burn it instead of detonating it. Burning makes power. Detonating breaks parts and kills people. That distinction, which sounds simple when you say it out loud, was the foundation of everything the Surfers would go on to do. So they decided to build a car. Skinner's mother took out a $5,000 furniture loan, and almost none of it actually went to furniture. They got military surplus chrome moly tubing. They patterned the chassis on one of Chris Karamesine's early cars. They built the whole thing in the garage at the Red Apple Motel, under fluorescent lights, between a Coke machine and a water faucet, in the kind of heat that turns a Southern California summer into something you just endure. They didn't paint it. They didn't letter it. Nitromethane was going to eat the paint anyway, so why bother? They put one angle cam sticker on it and a yellow injector scoop on top, and that was the whole livery. They made the cockpit deliberately too small to fit either of them, because neither of them wanted to drive it. They were the smart guys. They were going to build the car, tune the car, and pay somebody else to be the test pilot. Now, here is where their financial situation gets really kind of incredible because look, they had no money. None. They cut their own fuel nozzles on Tom's father's jeweler's lathe. Their flow bench for testing fuel injectors was the kitchen sink at the Red Apple, because the water tap happened to deliver about 60 pounds per square inch, which was exactly what most factory injectors saw on race day. When they finally needed a longer wheelbase on the car, they cut a hole in the back wall of the garage and pushed the chassis out into the motel courtyard so they could keep working on it. Skinner later said they made friends with all the parts. They had very intimate relationships with each of them. You look at the bearings, he said, and the bearing kind of talks to you and tells you what it needs so it won't get hurt. That was how they survived where better-funded teams were blowing up. Their motor lasted because they understood what was hurting it, and they fixed it before it broke. The first time the car ran at Lyons Dragstrip near Long Beach, it wouldn't even start. Tom Honeycutt, who was a regular in the pits at Lyons, later remembered watching them push-start it up and down the return road for lap after lap. The verdict around Lions that day was simple and it was brutal. These guys are not drag racers. Who are they? They went through a parade of drivers in those early months. A guy named Roy Tuller, Bob Muravez, Lotus John Morton himself, who got his top fuel license in the surfer's car in one terrifying day at Lions and wrote about it later in his autobiography. A guy named Jim Crosser drove it briefly. Nothing was clicking. And then in 1964, they tried out a kid named Mike Sorokin. Siroken was a Santa Monica kid like them. He hung out at the same hamburger stand they did, a place called the 19th at Jefferson and Selva in Culver City, which was the West Side street racing capital on any given Friday night. He had spent 2 years at City College studying electronics. He was hyperactive. He was fearless. He had absolutely no interest in the mechanical side of any of it. As Jobe told the story, Siroken would just say that's your problem whenever anything broke. Skinner gave him his standard reflex test, which involved catching a series of falling coins. He passed. The chemistry between the three of them clicked immediately, and within a few months, the surfers' results started to turn. Now we have to talk about the tuning, because this is the part that made them famous, and this is the part that made the rest of the sport completely and thoroughly insane with frustration. Everybody else in 1965 was running nitromethane somewhere between 70 and 90%. The rest of the load was alcohol or methanol or in some cases water. Keith Black, who was building motors for the Hawaiian, called a 75% load heavy. The conventional wisdom across the entire sport was that you could not run pure nitro. The motor would detonate itself to pieces. Pistons would crack. Heads would lift. The car would go boom on the starting line in front of everybody and their mother. Jobe had read the chemistry papers. He knew the conventional wisdom was wrong. And he came up with a tune-up that nobody else could replicate, because nobody else understood what he was doing or why he was doing it. This is where it gets really interesting. The surfers ran somewhere between 94 and 96% nitromethane, with the balance being toluene, which burns cleaner than alcohol. They put a drop of blue food dye in the fuel just to mess with whoever was looking in their churn. When the press asked them what they ran, they said 100% and claimed they had broken all their hydrometers. That was a lie. It was deliberate disinformation. They wanted everybody else to either try it and blow up or stay scared and stay slow. But here was the real magic beneath all of that misdirection. They ran about 200 pounds per square inch of fuel pressure through tiny custom machine nozzles, 3 times what everybody else was running or more, and that atomized the nitro so finely that it would burn cleanly instead of detonating. Combined with low compression and a used GMC blower that they ran without an idler pulley because one less part was one less thing to break, the whole package made more power than anybody else's setup, and it lasted longer too. Jobe put it like this: they had it planned so that you couldn't destroy the thing almost no matter what you did. In 1965, the surfers absolutely crushed it. They won or set low elapsed time or set top speed at most of the West Coast Strip. Lions, San Fernando, Fontana, Riverside, Irwindale, Pomona, Fremont. On a summer match race tour that took them across the country, they won in Amarillo, Texas, sweeping a doubleheader against Eddie Hill and Vance Hunt after Roland Leong's Hawaiian got damaged in a tow. They won in Salt Lake City, Pocatello, Union Grove, Rockford, Maple Grove, Atco, Denver. Drag Racing magazine named them the #1 team in the West. And here is the thing about all of those wins. They were doing it on a budget that would have made most of their competitors laugh out loud if they had known the actual numbers. There is one story from November of 1965 at Fontana that just about sums up the entire team and everything they stood for. They were running a UDRA event and they holed the block in the semifinal. Most teams would have packed up, loaded the trailer, and gone home. That was the rational decision. That was the adult decision. The surfers plugged the hole with a piece of cardboard. They hose-clamped the crank journal. They lined up for the final and Siroken ran almost the full quarter mile before the motor finally let go for good. They lost the race and gained a legend. The story of the cardboard and silver tape got told and retold around the pits for years afterward, because it captured something true about who they were. They were the guys who found a way when there was no way, who looked at a catastrophic mechanical failure and decided it was merely an inconvenience. By the start of 1966, they were the team to beat. And the biggest race of the year was coming up in March. The United States Fuel and Gas Championships at Famoso Raceway just outside Bakersfield. The Bakersfield March Meet. The biggest gathering of AA fuel dragsters ever assembled in the history of the sport. Over 100 top fuel cars showed up. The biggest names in the business. The deepest field anyone had ever seen at a drag strip anywhere in America. The format was wild. They ran a 64-car bracket on Saturday and a separate 32-car bracket on Sunday. And the two top eliminators from each day met in a unified final on Sunday afternoon. The surfers ran a 7.34 in the Saturday field, and they won it outright. They sat out Sunday entirely, conserving the motor, conserving the car, thinking 3 steps ahead the way engineers think. And then in the unified final, they lined up against the hometown favorites, Warren and Coburn out of Bakersfield, in front of a crowd that very much wanted to see the local boys win. Warren red-lighted. The surfers won the biggest race in top fuel drag racing. They also set low elapsed time and top speed of the entire meet at 210 miles per hour. It was the first time an independent low-budget team had ever won the March Meet. Most people who were there still call it the purest drag race ever run at that facility. According to Cole Cowan, on the night of that victory, Mike and Robin Sorokin conceived their son Adam. That is hard to verify at this distance, but it has become part of the story and it belongs there regardless. That spring and summer of 1966, the surfers kept right on winning match races up and down the country. Meanwhile, in the background, Skinner and Jobe started building a second car. A full-body dragster with bodywork by master fabricator Tom Hanna, who was probably the best aluminum craftsman in the sport at that moment. It was going to be their 1967 car. It was going to be beautiful. In September of 1966, they went to Indianapolis for the NHRA U.S. Nationals. That weekend at Indy is famous for a couple of reasons, and both of them say something important about who the surfers were as people. The first is that the Hilborn Injector Company was strong-arming Roland Leong's Hawaiian team to stop running an Endrel injector mid-tour. The surfers heard about it and they just loaned Leong their own famous yellow injector scoop right out of their pit, no hesitation, no negotiation, no asking for anything in return. Mike Snively drove the Hawaiian to a top fuel win that weekend wearing the surfer scoop on top of his blower. That kind of generosity was very much who they were. It was not a calculated PR move. It was not an attempt to build goodwill with a competitor. It was just what you did when a fellow racer needed help and you had the thing he needed sitting right there in front of you. What nobody at Indy knew was that this was the last race the surfers were ever going to run. Because what happened next was not a defeat. It was not a tragedy in the conventional sense. It was not a fight or a falling out or a sponsor pulling the plug. It was a decision. A cold, quiet, deliberate decision made by 2 engineers looking at a ledger and running the numbers and not liking what the numbers said. The way Cole Cowan tells it, which is the most detailed account we have of this moment, is that there was a weekend at San Fernando Raceway sometime in 1966 where the surfers won an 8-car top fuel show. They won the whole thing. And when Skinner did the math afterward in his meticulous ledger, he came up with a net loss of about $5. They had won the entire program and gone home $5 in the hole. That number was the trigger. But the decision itself was made out of 3 things stacked on top of each other, and you need to understand all 3 of them to understand why 2 guys in their mid-20s who were at the absolute peak of the sport walked away from it. The first was the economic. The sport was professionalizing fast, and sponsorship money was flowing in, but it was flowing to the personalities and the showmen. Garlits, Prudhomme, the snake and the mongoose. The guys who could sell paint schemes and give interviews and move merchandise. Jobe and Skinner were engineers. They did not want to be entertainers. And the prize money available to independent teams was simply not keeping up with the cost of parts, fuel, and travel. You could win the race and still go home broke. That was not a sustainable model, and they both knew it. The second reason was philosophical, and this one is the one that I think gets overlooked when people tell this story. Jobe saw exactly where Top Fuel was going, and he did not like what he saw. He said it like this: rules create a funnel, and at the end this just creates red dragsters and green ones and blue ones. The only thing left is the color, and that is taken care of by the sponsor. That is evolution. He told a friend named Michael Cannon years later that they foresaw a day when the cars would all look exactly the same and the only difference would be the paint job, which the sponsor would determine. And that scenario was of absolutely no interest to either of them. They had gotten into drag racing because it was a wide-open creative engineering free-for-all. There were no rules. You did not need to be rich. You could do whatever you could think of, and if you were smart enough and careful enough, you could beat people who had 20 times your budget. That version of the sport was disappearing in front of them, and they could see it happening in real time. The third reason was safety. Parts were not living up to their longevity standard, as Cowan put it, and people were getting killed. The clutch was a particular concern. Clutches in 1966 were getting more and more aggressive. They were holding more power. They were being pushed harder and harder by teams chasing tenths of a second on the elapsed time clock. And when they let go violently and without warning. There had already been drivers killed by clutch explosions that sawed the chassis right in half at speed. Skinner and Jobe had built their car to be bulletproof in the bottom end, but the clutch was upstream of all their tuning. They could not engineer their way out of that one. They could not read the white papers and find a solution in the chemistry. So they decided to quit. And they did something pretty remarkable when they made that decision. They told Siroken. They sat him down and they laid it out. Jobe later remembered what he said to him almost word for word. Hey, if you don't think that you have to do this for the rest of your life, why don't you look at it from the standpoint that we went out and did a bunch of wild stuff? Had a great time. Kicked a lot of names, took a lot of names, and we're all in one piece, and we don't have a nick on us. Let's just forget about it. Siroken's answer was simple and it was immediate. No. I think I want to keep going. I like doing this. You have to understand who Siroken was at that moment to understand why that answer was the only answer he was ever going to give. He was 27 years old. He had a wife. He had a baby on the way, or maybe already born depending on which version of the timeline you trust. He had spent 2 years studying electronics in college because he thought it was the thing he was supposed to do, and he had walked away from that to drive a fuel dragster. The Santa Monica Evening Outlook caught up with him in those months after the team folded. He told the reporter pretty plainly, "I think everybody has some kind of dream. This was mine and I'm living it. You can't ask for much more. That is not stupidity. That is not recklessness dressed up in philosophical language. That is a guy who finally found the thing he was put on earth to do and was not about to give it back to anybody, not even to the 2 best friends he had in the world." So Skinner and Jobe sold both cars. The old race car and the brand new Tom Hanna full-bodied 1967 car that had never even turned a wheel under power. They sold them to 2 brothers from Brooklyn named Richie and Bobby Bandel. Siroken himself wrote about it in a letter to a soldier he was corresponding with named Joe Bixby. "The new car we were building when we quit racing is almost finished, and it is, without a doubt, the best-looking car in drag racing. Richie Bandel from Brooklyn bought the car. We all hate to see it go. The Bandels ran the new car briefly. They took it to the 1967 Winter Nationals at Pomona. Then they sold it on to a man named Gordon Tatum, who kept it hidden away in a garage for decades. the most beautiful AA fuel dragster ever built by anybody besides Tom Hanna, and it never raced under the Surfer banner. Not once. So in late 1966, Jobe and Skinner were out. Siroken was looking for a ride, and the next year of his life was going to be a tour of the sport's biggest names and operations. He drove for Ed Pink for a couple of months. He drove for a guy named Blake Hill for about a month. Then in the middle of 1967, Roland Leong put him in the second Hawaiian, which was a brand new 426 Hemi car running alongside Mike Snively's older 392 motor. Siroken won the Stardust National Open in Las Vegas for Leong. He was still one of the best drivers in the sport. Anyone who saw him work a starting line knew that. Don Prudhomme said as much in later interviews. The reflexes, the instinct, the ability to hold a car straight when everything was trying to push it sideways, all of that was still completely intact. Late in 1967, he started moonlighting for a Bakersfield racer named Tony Waters while planning a 1968 owner-driver partnership with another West Coast racer named Paul Gummy. And here is the part of this story that hits hardest when you sit with it for a minute. On December 29, 1967, Siroken went to Los Angeles International Airport to pick up a brand new Bear Dragster chassis that had been shipped in from a builder in Colorado. That chassis was going to be the Siroken Gummy car for 1968. It was the first time in his entire career that he was going to have ownership in the equipment he drove. He was going to be an owner-driver. He was going to have a piece of the thing he loved. The next day, December 30, 1967, he showed up at Orange County International Raceway in Tony Waters' car for first-round eliminations. Just one more race for someone else's team before his own program got started. Just one more run down the quarter-mile before everything changed. What happened next is exactly what Skinner and Jobe had been afraid of for a year. At about half-track, at somewhere around 218 miles per hour, the clutch in Waters' dragster exploded. The flywheel sawed straight through the bell housing and the chassis. The rear half of the car seized and the whole thing flipped end over end down the strip. Siroken was partially ejected from the roll cage. He was killed instantly. He was 28 years old. His son Adam was a year old. You can find period photographs of the wreck if you look hard enough. The car is in two pieces. The front half is sitting upright on its slicks like it is still waiting for a flagman to drop his hand. The back half is somewhere further down the strip. That image, more than any trophy or timing slip or photograph of a victory, is the punctuation mark at the end of the surfer's story in the conventional sense. The team that knew when to walk away had walked away in late 1966. The driver who could not walk away was dead by the last weekend of 1967. 14 months. That is the entire distance between those two decisions and those two outcomes. Now, here is what most people don't realize about what came next, because most tellings of the surfer's story end right there at Orange County Raceway on December 30, 1967. They treat it as the finale, the tragedy that closes the chapter. But the real story, the story that I think is actually more interesting and more revealing about who these people were, is what happened in the 50 years that followed. Because Skinner and Jobe did not disappear. They did not retreat into quiet civilian lives and leave motorsport behind entirely. They just found new engineering problems to solve, which was all they had ever really been looking for in the first place. Skinner and Jobe stayed partners, not on a top fuel car, because they were done with quarter-mile drag racing forever and they meant it. They moved sideways into road racing. They went to work with a Canadian sports car driver named John Cannon, who had pulled off one of the great upsets of the Can-Am series in 1968, winning a rain-soaked race at Laguna Seca in a 2-year-old Lola, lapping the field after starting 15th on the grid. By 1969, Skinner and Jobe were prepping Cannon's Hogenstar Eagle for the SCCA Continental Championship, which was American Formula 5000. Cannon won races at Riverside and Sears Point and Motorsport and finished fourth in the standings that year. The next year, 1970, They prepped his Hogenstar McLaren M10B and Cannon won the whole title. Wins at Riverside, Kent, Wisconsin, and Elkhart Lake. The same engineering minds that had built a kitchen sink flow bench and run 94% nitro through custom machine nozzles were now at the front of a completely different form of motorsport, and they were winning there too. In between all of that road racing work, Jobe took on a project that almost nobody outside of a very small circle knows about. He went down to a shop in Long Beach where Mickey Thompson was building his Challenger 2 land speed streamliner. Tom Hanna, the same guy who had built the body of the Surfer's second car, was working on the aluminum bodywork. Jobe joined the project under Hanna and Nye Frank. The Challenger 2 was supposed to set a new world land speed record at Bonneville in 1968. Shakedown runs, depending on which source you trust, got somewhere between 365 and 400 miles per hour before the program stalled out. Then the rain came, the salt flooded, Ford pulled its sponsorship, and the car sat in a garage for the next 20 years. But Jobe had worked on it. His fingerprints were on one of the most ambitious land speed projects ever attempted in America, and almost nobody knew his name in connection with it. That was very much on brand for Tom Jobe. In the 70s, Jobe got into Department of Transportation high-speed research trains that ran in excess of 200 miles per hour. Then he got into stadium truck racing back when that was a brand new category that nobody quite knew what to do with, and he pioneered the use of automatic transmissions in that class at a time when everyone else was still convinced you needed a manual. Eventually, he landed at American Honda Racing, HRC, Honda's factory racing operation in Southern California, and that is where he stayed until 2009. The people who worked with Jobe at Honda talk about him the same way the drag racing guys talked about him, which is with a kind of reverence that you do not hear very often when people are describing a colleague. Gary Matz called him by far the smartest guy he had ever met in his entire life, and Matz had met a lot of smart people in a long career in professional motorsport. Jobe could TIG weld. He could gas weld. He could form a fuel tank out of a sheet of aluminum starting from nothing but raw material and a clear picture in his head of what the finished piece needed to look like. He could look at a broken piston and tell you not just what physically caused it to fail, but what the engine was trying to do at the precise moment of failure, which is a completely different and much more useful kind of information. He worked on Honda motocross teams and Honda road racing teams. He worked on corporate engineering problems that had nothing to do with racing at all. At one point he was involved in replacing the diesel engines in Rose Parade floats with Honda Accord engines because the Accord engines were quieter and cleaner and the parade organizers were getting pressure about emissions. After he officially retired in 2009, he stayed on as a consultant designing service tools for Honda dealers because the idea of simply stopping, of no longer having an engineering problem in front of him that needed solving, was apparently not something he was willing to entertain. Skinner went a different direction after the road racing years wound down. He stayed in the racing world a little longer, building a state-of-the-art flow bench for Ed Pink's engine shop in the 70s. Drag racers like Jeff Cordy worked alongside him at Pink's during those years and remembered him as someone who approached every problem with the same quiet, methodical intensity that had characterized everything he had ever done. But sometime in the middle of the 70s, Skinner moved north. He bought a house in Sebastopol up in Sonoma County wine country. The property came with an apple orchard. He spent the rest of his life there. He built things. He repaired things. He invented things, mostly for friends and mostly on commission, because he was constitutionally incapable of charging what his time and skill were actually worth to strangers. He volunteered at the Sebastopol Community Project, which was a teen culinary training program that taught at-risk kids how to cook and how to run a kitchen. He danced. His obituary specifically mentions that he danced impressively and consistently, which tells you something important about the kind of person he was in the years after racing. He studied languages. He traveled. He started going by Roberto, which is the kind of detail that makes perfect sense when you think about who Bob Skinner had always been underneath the meticulous ledger and the Pendleton shirt. In March of 1997, all three surfers were inducted into the International Drag Racing Hall of Fame at Don Garlits Museum in Ocala, Florida. It was the kind of official recognition that the sport occasionally gets around to giving people decades after the fact, and it was entirely deserved. Skinner showed up to the ceremony in two-tone striped red pants, a flannel shirt and a Panama hat, because of course he did. Adam Siroken, who was about to start his own drag racing career as a top fuel driver in the nostalgia ranks, accepted his father's award on Mike's behalf. And by the late 90s, Adam was driving fuel dragsters at strips up and down California for the Champion Speed Shop team, running in the nostalgia top fuel class and doing it with a level of skill that made people who had known his father stop and look twice. Jobe stepped into a role that nobody asked him to step into but that he took on anyway when Adam started racing. Adam later told the story like this. Tom Jobe was the only surfer who ever talked to him about who his father was and told him stories about the man behind the legend. The first thing Jobe did when Adam started driving was try to talk him out of it. He really tried, for the same reasons he had tried to talk Mike out of continuing back in 1966, because he understood the math, and the math had not changed in 30 years. And when Jobe realized that Adam was going to drive no matter what anybody said, he switched without hesitation from trying to stop him to mentoring him and cheering him on, which is more or less exactly what he had done with Mike 3 decades earlier, except this time the story had a different ending. This is where it gets really interesting, because what Jobe did for Adam Siroken is the thing that reframes this entire story if you let it. He could have kept his distance. He could have told himself that he had already done everything he could do for the Siroken family and that the outcome of Mike's decision was not his responsibility to carry. Instead, he showed up. He told the stories that needed to be told. He gave the kid a connection to a father he had never really known. He became the living link between what Mike Sorokin had been at the peak of his life and what Adam was trying to build in his own. Bob Skinner died on August 15, 2015, or August 18, depending on which source you read. The NHRA says the 15th. His family obituary in the Press Democrat says the 18th. The discrepancy has not been resolved publicly and probably does not matter very much in the larger scheme of things. What is not in dispute is where he was. He was at his workshop in Sebastopol. He was working on his truck. He was 74 years old. It was sudden and it was unexpected. The official cause of death has not been published, but the phrasing in the NHRA obituary strongly suggests a sudden cardiac event. He had been dancing impressively and consistently right up to the end, which is exactly the way Bob Skinner would have chosen to go out if he had been given the option of choosing. 4 years later, in 2019, Tom Jobe got sick. He told Cole Cowan about it, but he told very few other people because that was also very much who Tom Jobe was. The illness was almost certainly cancer. Cowan later referenced chemotherapy or radiation treatments that Jobe had been offered by his doctors. Jobe refused them. In Cowan's words, it didn't pencil out financially as well as existentially, which is just about the most Tom Jobe thing anyone has ever said about anything. A friend of his named Bob Higginson was with him in those final hours. Jobe gave him a message to pass along to anyone who might care about what happened to him. "Tell people not to cry for me," he said. "I've had the most amazing life and have the most incredible friends. It's more than I could have ever dared to ask for." Tom Jobe died on September 7, 2019, 1 week after his 79th birthday. Cole Cowan wrote the obituary that ran in NHRA's National Dragster. He said Jobe cut this mortal coil and surfed into the cosmic foam about the same way he quit drag racing all those years back. That is to say, quietly and with dignity. So here is the question this whole story has been building toward, because every story like this one eventually arrives at the place where you have to ask it directly. Was it the right call? Was walking away the right decision? The easy answer is yes. 2 of them lived into their 70s. 1 of them died at 28. The math is right there in front of you, and you do not need to think about it very hard at all. But the harder answer, the more honest answer, is that it is not actually that simple, because Mike Sorokin was not a fool. He was not reckless in any way that mattered. He was not some thrill-seeking kid who had never thought seriously about consequences. He was one of the best top fuel drivers of his entire generation, and the people who knew the sport best said so. Don Prudhomme said so. Roland Leong said so. The timing slip said so. The reflexes, the instinct, the ability to hold 2,000 horsepower straight down a quarter-mile strip when everything is trying to kill you, all of that was genuine and all of it was his. He had finally found the thing in life he was supposed to do. And when Jobe sat him down in the autumn of 1966 and made the pitch about how they could all just walk away in one piece with no nicks on them and a great story to tell, Siroken said no. Not because he did not understand the math. He understood the math fine. He said no because he was living his dream, and he was not going to give it back to anybody, not even his best friends. Everybody has some kind of dream, he told that reporter from the Santa Monica Evening Outlook. This was mine and I'm living it. You can't ask for much more. Here's the thing about those words. They are not the words of someone who has not thought about what he is doing. They are the words of someone who has thought about it very carefully and arrived at a conclusion that most people never reach, which is that the thing worth doing is worth doing even when the risk is real and the ledger does not balance in your favor. What Jobe and Skinner had was something fundamentally different from what Siroken had, and that difference is the whole story. Drag racing for them was an engineering problem. It was a wide-open creative laboratory in which 2 smart kids from Santa Monica could outsmart the entire sport with library research and a kitchen sink flow bench and custom machine nozzles and a drop of blue food dye for misdirection. The moment the sport started turning into a sponsor-driven, owner-driver business with regulated equipment and homogenized paint schemes, the part of it they had loved was gone. The thing that made it worth the risk was gone. So they cashed out. And here is what most people don't realize about that walk-away decision. It was not really about money in the end. It was not even really about safety, though the safety concerns were real and documented and entirely rational. It was about love. They had loved a specific version of the sport, and that version was ending. They could see it ending with a clarity that most of their competitors could not, because most of their competitors were inside the thing and could not get far enough outside it to see its shape. Skinner and Jobe got outside it. They saw the shape, and they had the cold, quiet clarity to leave before they got caught up in something they no longer recognized. For Siroken, none of that mattered. He did not love the engineering problem. He loved the driving. And the driving was still the driving whether the car had a sponsor's name on the side or not. The quarter mile was still the quarter mile. The staging beams were still the staging beams. The feeling of a top fuel car coming alive underneath you at the hit of the throttle was still the most extraordinary thing a human being could experience in 1967, and it was his thing, the thing that belonged to him in a way that nothing else ever had. So he stayed. Both of those answers are correct. Both of them are honest. They just lead to different places. The surfer's second car, the beautiful Tom Hanna full-body dragster that they sold to the Bandles before it ever raced under their banner, went into Gordon Tatum's garage and stayed there for decades. The original race car, the one that won Bakersfield, is somewhere too, though the chain of ownership is harder to trace at this distance. The Red Apple Motel, where both cars were built, is gone. A Chase Bank sits at 2711 Wilshire Boulevard in Santa Monica now. Cowan filmed there with Jobe before Jobe died, and you can find the footage online if you look for it. It is just a parking lot and a bank, but if you know what used to be there, if you know about the kitchen sink flow bench and the hole cut in the back wall and the Coke machine in the courtyard, it is still kind of holy ground. Adam Siroken is still driving nostalgia top fuel cars for the Champion Speed Shop team out of South San Francisco. He has been doing it for over 25 years. Every year at the Bakersfield March Meet, there is an award called the Mike Sorokin Award that goes to the most competitive low-budget top fuel team. They started giving it out at the 50th anniversary celebration in 2016. Tom Jobe was there for that one. So was Roland Leong. There is something Cole Cowan said about Jobe near the end of the obituary that I think is the right way to land this whole story. Skinner and Jobe knew when the math no longer worked. They had a meticulous ledger and they ran the numbers, and the numbers said it was time to find another engineering challenge. So they did. And then they spent the next half-century quietly making everything they touched better. Honda race bikes, Formula 5000 cars, stadium trucks, land speed streamliners, high-speed research trains, the apple orchards of Sonoma County. The kid of the friend they could not save. The team that knew when to walked away not because they were scared and not because they had lost, but because they were paying attention. Because they could see something coming that the rest of the sport could not quite see yet. And because they understood that the version of the thing they loved was a small window and the window was closing. The driver who could not walk away could not because he was inside the window. He was the window, and he was not going to step outside of it for anybody. Somewhere right now there are 2 orange airplane seats that Tom Jobe kept in his shop for 50 years. They came out of the original surfer's garage at the Red Apple Motel. Bob Higginson has them now. They are the chairs that Tom and Bob sat in while they worked out the chemistry that ran a car at 210 miles per hour in 1966. If those chairs could talk, they would probably just laugh and say they kicked a lot of names, took a lot of names, and they don't have a nick on them. Then they would ask where Mike is. And nobody in the room would have a good answer.